At the Johns Hopkins Institute of Bioethics, and his work, if I know rightly, explores the intersection of ethics and health and science policy. And he's also served on numerous state and federal advisory panels, which is what you're here to talk to us today about, because you'll probably know from our advertising of Jeff Straub. Jeff chaired the Committee on the Use of Chimpanzees in Biomedical and Behavioral Research for the Institute of Medicine to investigate National Institute for Health guidelines that permitted biomedical research on chimpanzees and its implications. So this you're going to talk about today. Because it's such a small group, we've just spoken, and I think we're happy to do more of an interactive session because I know a couple of people have to leave early. So
it's fine with me. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
So I'm going to start experimenting on us.
Yeah.
Steak and chimpanzees.
Yeah, exactly. You see, you have a copy of the report.
Yeah.
There it is, which is available online. That's printed in small format besides.
It's a very long report.
So good. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for coming. I know this is an off time for your seminar, so I appreciate your making the effort. So as you heard, I chaired the IOM committee. Do you know what the Institute of Medicine is? Should I do a little background about that? Is that a meaningful term? No? So the Institute of Medicine is part of the National Academies of Science in the U.S., which is not a governmental entity. It was actually founded during the Abraham Lincoln administration, which for us is a long time ago in the 1850s, to give objective advice in matters of science and public policy. So the Institute of Medicine is the medicine and health sciences part of the National Academies. So this is a talk about the use of chimpanzees, and the way that the Institute of Medicine got requested or really contracted to do this study comes from what's on this slide. So the U.S., maybe you don't know this, the U.S., as of the time this study began, was the only country in the world besides Gabon that kept, now we still keep, chimpanzees in research colonies. So every other country, the UK since actually the mid-1990s, I mean, John was very involved in the decisions to end the use of great apes in the UK. The EU since 2010, 09 maybe. Japan in the 2000s, you can go through the list. The only country we don't actually know about is China because they have not been forthcoming about whether they maintain chimpanzees. Most people think that they do not. They definitely breed rhesus for sale and probably for research, but they probably do not have chimpanzees. So it makes the U.S. Sort of an oddball, an outlier in a not very happy way. And at the time that this study began, there were almost 1,000 in 4 different research colonies in the U.S. You can imagine they're in warm weather parts of the United States, Texas, Louisiana, and Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia. 2/3 of those are either owned by, literally outright owned by, or are engaged in research that the National Institutes of Health, our NIH, supports the research. So that's important because in our system, if they're privately owned, then federal rules need not apply. So that would mean the 1/3 of the 1,000 that are privately owned are used in pharmaceutical industry research and are not subject to the rules that would be dictated by the NIH. So that's why it matters how many are owned by or supported by the NIH. What started the committee or prompted the NIH to contract with IOM to do this analysis was that there was a colony in New Mexico. 125 animals were living on an Air Force base. Hi. We have enough chairs?
Yeah, yes.
So 125 animals were living on an Air Force base in New Mexico for reasons that are a little unusual in that they had been owned by a person, a man who had decided he would own a bunch of chimpanzees, and they were bred in captivity. They grew to 125. He could no longer maintain them. It was very expensive. It is very expensive. And so because they were not being well cared for, the NIH stepped in and bought them outright. And because they were in New Mexico, it was deemed a bad idea to move them, and so there was a contract let to an entity that maintained them at an Air Force base in New Mexico. That 10-year contract expired in 2010, and the proposal by the NIH at that point was to move them into one of the 4 research colonies, which made people crazy because up to that point, during the 10-year contract, the animals had been retired from research. Not technically, but in practice. They had not been used in research, and so moving them back into the research colonies in the other 4 places that animals were kept would have meant returning them to research, and that upset people in the animal rights and animal welfare communities. I don't know, you probably haven't had this experience in a long time, but chimpanzees raise more interest in terms of their care and use as animals in the US than any other species. You haven't had this in the UK for a long time, but I know there's a lot of activism around animal use in the UK as well, and there's nothing more hot button in the US than the use of chimpanzees. So, members of both the state and federal level politician delegation in the state of New Mexico got very upset that the animals were going to be moved from their state, not because they thought so much about animal welfare, but because that meant jobs would leave their state. And so they got a lot of pressure from the community, and they had their own interests, and so they said to the director of the NIH, you need an expert opinion. And so that's why the committee was appointed in April of 2011. And the way the National Academies work, so that's the National Research Council, which is kind of the parent of all but the IOM. Together with the IOM, they get a contract from the NIH. So the NIH pays, but it's not able to direct the work of the committees that are appointed. So that committee was appointed in April of 11, and then I'm going to talk about this at the end, the working group that was appointed by the NIH to implement the recommendations of this committee issued its guidance in just a couple months ago, now actually less than 2 months ago, end of January of 13. So that's how we got to the beginning of the story. Any questions about that?
Can I just ask a quick question?
Yeah.
What is it about chimpanzees that makes them so helpful?
So helpful in research?
Yeah.
Well, I'll talk about that.
Yeah.
Good. So let me, before I answer the question, tell you about how chimpanzees have been used in research. So this is a graph of the years in the 2000s of use of chimpanzees by the NIH. So that means research funded by our National Institutes of Health that involved chimpanzees, and you can see on the right there the key by bar graph. The important thing is that it's never been more than 50 projects, 50, in any single year, and in each project there's only a handful of animals used, partly because there are not that many available, and partly because small number studies are all that has ever been done with chimpanzees, which is one of the arguments about the quality of the science. Very small numbers of animals leads to very questionable results. The important thing as well to take away from this is that the vast majority of the projects are infectious disease. Hepatitis is the biggest bar, and that's because the only animal besides humans that are infected by the hepatitis virus is chimpanzees. This research over that 10-year period is hepatitis C, but prior to that it was the other forms of hepatitis A and then B. A little other, so you see AIDS, HIV is that sort of other greenish bar, a little bit of neuroscience compared to genomics, which is non-invasive research because it just relies on specimens or blood, existing specimen, tissue specimens or blood, and then behavioral research is that gold bar, which is also generally non-invasive. So vast majority is infectious disease research, which is getting to your question. Anything else before I go past this? Okay. So here's your question. So why have they been used? So one is because they're very similar to us. There's a big argument in the comparative genomics world about how similar, and you sometimes hear 99%, 99 point something percent, but I didn't know much about this before. I'll talk about how I got to be appointed to this in a second, but depends who you ask about what the answer to that question is and whether it really even matters, because they have some stretches of genes that we don't, and the converse too. So it's not even a fair comparison to say that we are 99 point whatever percent, not to mention all the epigenetics and all the things that you know that matter. But that said, they are very genetically similar to us. Second, and why infectious disease research has been so important in this population, is because immunologically they're incredibly close to us. In some aspects of their immune system are unrecognizable as different from humans, so very important. Physiologically, morphologically, they're similar to us, as it makes some sense. And then behaviorally, so if you're interested in doing behavioral research, they're about the best thing next to humans to study things like cooperation. So there's famous research done at Yerkes in Atlanta by a guy named Franz de Waal. Anybody know this work? Yeah, you do. So you put a bunch of bananas way high up in the enclosure that one animal can't reach on his or her own, and then a bunch of crates stacked around, and they have to put them together to climb up to get the bananas, but they are too rickety for one animal to do it him or herself, and so they have to work together, and then one runs up and gets the bananas and then shares with the others in return for having helped. So if you want to study how cooperation works and maybe the evolution of that sort of behavior, then they're a good model for that, better than any other animal besides humans. Second, there are some cases, I already mentioned hepatitis, where there's just no other applicable animal model besides humans. So to sort of jump to why that matters, if you want to study the development of a prophylactic vaccine for hepatitis C, it's really difficult to do that in human subjects if you want to do a challenge study. That is, intentionally expose the subjects to the infection, right? Ethically speaking, even with whatever consent you thought you could obtain, you wouldn't be permitted to do that research when there's no rescue. So we do that with malaria vaccine research. You know about that, where you put your arm in the mosquito chamber of infected mosquitoes, and then you're kept in clinic for some number of days and tested, but if you are infected, you're given medication. But there's no equivalent in the world of hepatitis. So if you want to do a challenge study for a development of a prophylactic vaccine, it may be the only model. Turns out to be pretty much the only really compelling case, but that's for some people still a compelling case. And then I mentioned certain behavior. Why? For reasons that I've already articulated about the ethics of certain kinds of research on humans. Among the reasons that we also have in the US used chimpanzees for so long is because they live a really long time and we don't kill them. We don't terminate them at the end of research. There's a policy since the mid-1990s that there'll be no euthanasia in chimpanzees. So in captivity, assuming that they're not dying from whatever they're being exposed to in research, they'll live maybe 70 years, as you see, and certainly into the 60s. And because of they're very expensive to maintain, they're kept in these colonies. We don't kill them. They live a long time. They become an available resource, and so an available resource is a used resource, is sort of the argument. So the 4 places they keep them have a business model which requires them to pay for the ongoing upkeep of these animals, which is to encourage their use in research in return for money. So some of these are about, it's necessary for the science, right? No other applicable animal model would fall into that category, but others on this list would not, like because they're available, because they live a long time. So we have a kind of mixed bag of why chimpanzees have been used. That's hopefully answering your question. Okay. Anything else on this? It'll get more interesting, hopefully. So you don't have to read all this. I mean, you're welcome to, of course. The important thing about this is that you can take my word for it, that nowhere on this statement of task does it say anything about the ethics of the use of chimpanzees. So the IOM was contracted by the NIH to do an analysis of the use of chimpanzees in biomedical and behavioral research, but was constrained in the statement of task, which is written in combination with the NIH and the IOM leadership. So there's nothing at all about the ethical permissibility of the use of this species, intentionally. And the way the IOM and the National Academies works, when they appoint a committee, this is given to the group. The group doesn't get to help craft the statement of task, which is understandable, but in some ways unfortunate. So the politics of how this happens is, of course, important. You'll get certain outcomes to a process based on what you're allowed to talk about or what questions you're asked. And so as you see here, the important thing to point out is in that first bullet, where it says explore contemporary and anticipated questions to determine if chimpanzees are or will be necessary. So that's my italicizing, but that is as the task was written for research discoveries, blah, blah, blah. So it was to focus on, is it necessary to use chimpanzees, not is it ethical or ethically permissible. Okay, and you can read the rest. Any questions about this?
Could I quickly
Yes.
ask? They didn't mention ethics in this remit, but they appointed you as a bioethicist.
We're
You'll
coming
hear
to
about that, I'm sure.
Yeah, we're absolutely coming to that. It's working. At least you're thinking in a way that I'm hoping you'll think as I progress. Yes, is the answer to your question. We'll talk more. So, as you just articulated, so here's the committee membership. What's interesting about this is not for who's listed, although some of that is interesting too. I'll just give you a quick run. So you see there's me. John Bartlett is an infectious disease HIV/AIDS specialist at Hopkins. Russ Bernard is an anthropologist. Floyd Bloom is a kind of polymath, but a basic scientist. Warner Green runs the Gladstone Institute at UCSF, which is vaccine and infectious disease research. Diane Griffin is a measles vaccinologist. Ed Harlow is a cancer researcher. Jay Kaplan is a veterinarian who does primate health stuff. Margaret Landy is the head of animal use at GSK. Fred Murphy, another infectious disease. Robert Sapolsky, you may know, is quite famous primatologist. And Sharon Terry runs something called the Genetic Alliance. She's meant to be the disease advocacy public representative. Now, there were 3 other members of the committee when it was appointed, so that's 12 on that list. There were 15. The other 3, 2 of them were excused when the vetting happened. So first meeting of an IOM committee is very particular. You go around the room and you introduce yourselves to your colleagues, and then you disclose everything you think might make you conflicted. And then your colleagues get to comment about ask questions about whether they're concerned about that. The idea being you have to feel comfortable with the people who you're going to be reaching consensus, hopefully, with whom you're going to be reaching consensus. It's very unusual, actually, but quite a productive process. 2 of the 3 fell away during that process. The third was the chair, a guy named Jack Stobo, that runs all of the health sciences campuses for the University of California. He's a very senior administrator who had been the chair of medicine at Johns Hopkins and then at one of the University of Texas medical schools. Somebody asked during the course of the going around the room, aren't there chimpanzee or at least non-human primate studies going on in some of the places where you have oversight responsibility? And he said, I don't know, which seemed also kind of implausible. And so somebody said, we need to find out. And then after that first meeting and before the next, he stepped down without explanation. 2 weeks elapsed and I got a phone call saying, we want you to step up as chair. So what happened in the interim was at that first meeting, there was the private process I already described. There's also a public process where you come together, where the public can be present, and in this case, the person at the NIH who's sort of contracting with IOM, delivers the charge to the committee. And I was asked during that part of the process to share a view that the group had come to in its private session, where we were very uncomfortable with having been told not to think about the ethics of the use of chimpanzees. So the committee, when we were, after we introduced ourselves, were talking about the charge, and somebody said, it doesn't make any sense to me that we're not talking about the gorilla in the room, to pardon the pun, which was, why are we here at all? And the answer is because there's something different about the use of this species, which is about the ethics of use of chimpanzees per se. And so the then chair said, Jeff, since you're the ethics person, we want you to articulate our shared concern. We kind of rehearsed it a little bit. And so when we came back in public session, I was then asked to share the collective view, which made me look very much like a champion of the ethics issues, which I would have been anyway, but I was representing the views of the collective. And so the politics were, what would be better than having the person who's the ethics guy chair this effort in terms of our winning over the concerned publics plural. Yes?
Just looking at that list, I mean, are they all, if you like, scientific researchers? In other words, it looks to
Yes.
me very pro-research,
It
not
does.
knowing the people. Is there anyone on the side of the chimps, or at least
No.
neutral, apart from yourself, perhaps?
Well,
But that's like having an abortionist on the HFEA.
yeah, well, it is a little bit like that. So the answer to your question is no, but let me give you a little more context, because this is interesting and part of what we should talk about anyway. So stepping back, when each of us got invited, we were vetted very briefly, and the first question we were asked is, do you have an opinion about the use of chimpanzees in research, either way? And if you said, I said, well, I have an opinion, and they said, well, do you have a formed opinion? And if you did have a formed opinion, then you were not considered any further. So you had to be open-minded about what the answer to the question might be. And we were all asked that. Clearly, some people's careers and their commitments to whatever they were studying would indicate they're being more pro-research than others. But amazingly, and I've served on a number of this kind of thing, I've never been on a group that was more open-minded and willing to really consider the information that we asked for, and thought it was important for answering the questions before us. So I don't think anybody came to this saying, I'm gung-ho, we have to continue to allow research on chimpanzees. I think of anybody on this list, I name a couple who were very pro. Diane Griffin is very pro-research, and she, I think, probably would have wished it came out differently than it did. And then Robert Sapolsky on the other end, who's a primatologist who has great respect and regard for great apes, and I think was willing to say we should prohibit any research at all. So, and everyone else laid in the middle, but we came to some consensus, which was, I think, an impressive thing to do given your correct observation. So, that's the short answer, long answer to your short question.
I'm not quite clear though, why appoint a bioethicist at
all.
all?
So that's a good question. And
It's fighting talk.
Well, given that
it's
there's no ethics in the remit.
right.
So.
And so I'll tell you a bit of this is the backstory that you won't read in however many pages are there in front of you. I told you the first meeting was April of 2011. I got a phone call in late February saying we're having our first meeting in April, and I said, okay, so who resigned or who, what happened? Because there's no way that you'd be waiting until 6 weeks before the first meeting to invite a member. And the person who invited me sheepishly said, we weren't going to have any ethics person at all until having reconsidered, because they do kind of a feeler around the kinds of people they're appointing, and they even float some names, and everybody kept saying you need an ethics person, even though it wasn't in the charge. So they felt like they had to. went a way that they had not predicted at all is pretty much the answer. So it went from no ethics person at all to one, which would have been hard, right? One person to carry that water is quite difficult, to that person being the chair. It's quite an unusual turn of events, and it wasn't anything we strategized around. It just sort of unfolded that way. And I think they were quite happy with the outcome and the process, but it wasn't because they had planned it carefully. So, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, or whatever if you have that equivalent in England. Okay, that answer your
Yeah.
It was a really interesting, and I have to say, very, very, very reticent. One, to be a member, given your, I think, correct. I shared your observation. You're adding me very late. It's not in the charge at all. Everyone else looks very pro-research. I'm going to get stampeded here, and I'm going to end up putting my name on something that I'm not really comfortable with, potentially. I mean, we all hope that doesn't happen, but it's really hard to know in prospect. And they promise upside down, sideways, no, we're being really careful who we invite, and so on and so forth. And it goes out. So the other thing about IOM reports is there's an internal vetting for quality and whether you've answered the questions you were asked, and then it goes out for external peer review. So there's at least a check that way. And so if you are just saying, no matter what evidence we've seen, this is what we think the answer is, that wouldn't make it through. So it all sort of shook out okay in the end. You look like you want to ask another.
I do.
Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to make the point that it sounds to me that these people, some of whom have vested interest and are working with the primates, would see themselves as being pro-chimpanzee, and that this division, are they pro-chimpanzee and pro the ethics of the chimpanzee, so that the division isn't quite as clear as what we think. There was the people who set the remit had a very clear vision that they were kind of like thinking in a dichotomy in a way of pro-science or anti-science is the wrong word, but pro-ethics. But in practice it sounds that the scientists who had an investment wanted to learn how to be ethical about the chimpanzees.
Well,
they wanted
that's a generous interpretation, okay. I think. So early on, so when I became chair, one of the things, actually, Margaret Landy was about the most interested in trying to learn how to be ethical, as you put it.
Yeah.
Which I don't think is how she would say it, but trying to better understand how to think about the ethics of the use of chimpanzees. And so we started to have conversations, but it became pretty obvious early on that it was going to require an entire tutorial that we didn't have time for. So somebody said, for instance, and this is not taking us, so this is fine, we're not wasting time here. Why don't we think about the use of chimpanzees like we think about the use of children in research? They can't decide for themselves. We let other people decide for them, but with sort of their best interests. And I said, that's fine, but that means we're going to say no to everything that's currently done. Because in terms of how children are treated in research, we only expose them to greater than minimal risk if there's some potential offsetting benefit to them, not just to people like them, but to them. So actually I have some sympathy for that kind of thinking, but I don't know that that's the conclusion that you really think we ought to be reaching. So let's hold that off as maybe a way if we think that that's the right answer, then we can use that as the right parallel. And then there's a lot of discussion about what are the ethics of using animals and what language do you use to even talk about that. So I gave people things to read, but it was not an ethics committee. And so we couldn't really treat it that way. And I'll show you and you probably have seen, because it looks like you've looked at the report, seen the language that did get written.
Yeah.
Right? It's quite brief, right?
Yeah.
And it signals some thinking. I've snuck some things in there. I'm interested to hear what you think about what it says, reading between lines. But it had to make it through peer review and the internal vetting, and yet hopefully say something. All right. let me keep going. So, this is what we've said in not many more words than is on this slide, actually. And it does. I mean, this, of course, had to first make it through the committee, and then all of the steps I've already described in terms of internal and external review. So, that first line is sort of the telling one. And then we say, well, we weren't an ethics group, and we weren't sufficiently constituted to take on the ethics, but we were suffused in our thinking about it. Okay, so that's about as much as we could say about how collectively we thought about it. Then there's a later, not listed here, but in the report itself, a kind of utilitarian justification articulated. Is how policy has grown up around the use of animals in research in the U.S. And so it seemed, because these are such high animals, given the way this all played out, that at least you could make the justification required very high. That was all that we could make that group understand in terms of the ethics of. So either I wasn't a good enough teacher, probably, there wasn't enough time, for sure, and then third, it wouldn't have made it through the vetting process anyway. So it was an example of getting as much as we could, given the constraints that were in front of us. So I've said it, I think, everybody here. Now what's really important is that last bullet. Right, so we all went into the process with the presumption that research on animals is acceptable, and that we're open to the idea that research on chimpanzees is acceptable. Right, because if we had come in saying it's ethically unacceptable to use chimpanzees in research, then it wouldn't matter whether they're necessary. Right? So you had to give in to that very basic ethical point to even be a member of this committee, which it was troubling to me, frankly. So the good news is that it came out in terms of necessity to sort of be pretty close to what we would have said was the most ethically appropriate outcome as well. So here's what we argued a lot, cutting to the chase here. So we had only 4 meetings, but lots and lots of phone conversations, and the meetings that we did have for many, many hours, locked in rooms together. So 12 people locked in a room together can come to some conclusion, right, if you're forced. You won't be let out of this room until, then you'll get to some conclusions. And we tried really hard to think of criteria, and I resorted to the language of principles, because it was very difficult for us to identify criteria that would make sense both in the biomedical and the behavioral research arenas, which was part of the charge, if you recall. Okay, so those are the 3 basic principles that we identified. One, you need the necessities built into that first one. What you're going to learn must be necessary to advance public health. So that means you can't get it any other way. You have to unpack what necessity means, but that's something of a higher bar than just, well, it'd be interesting from a science perspective. And remember, this is the NIH, so that's why advancing public health is appended there. Second, and this is actually really different, there must be no other model by which you could do this, and so this combination is important. The research can't be ethically performed on human subjects. So the implication is, if you want to know about human health, study humans first. Only if it's unethical to study humans can you then talk about studying chimpanzees, which I think people didn't appreciate even through the vetting process, that was a huge change in the presumption. Right, so that's the case of Hep C prophylactic vaccine studies. But in every other example of the things I showed you from that bar graph and everything that we looked at in terms of where chimpanzees had been used in the last 10 years and all the years before that, the only example where there is no other model and you can't ethically do the research on humans was Hep C prophylactic vaccine research, period. So that was left a kind of one single case that would satisfy number 1 and 2. And then if you're going to use animals, then second is a little easier. They must be maintained in what we termed ethologically appropriate environments, so environments like they would experience in the wild, although how you get there is a good question. And then the more controversial is that they have to acquiesce to research. So that was a term that we settled on because somebody said they need to be voluntary. So I had the same reaction that you just did. At least I had the same expression on my face that you just did. And I said, really, voluntary? How do you understand voluntary? I said, these are captive animals. I mean, they're sort of voluntary in the same way that prisoners are voluntary. That's sort of the best parallel that one could really find in human research. And if that's what we're going to pursue, then we need to introduce restrictions, and we don't probably want to end up there either. Not to mention, how would we know when a chimpanzee is actually volunteering versus not? And so, after much discussion, we settled on this notion of acquiescence, which is they're very, very smart animals, and they're highly trained and trainable. So if you want to draw blood from an animal, you can call them by name, or get one of the other chimps to go get the one you want. So you can say to John the chimp, go get Jeff, and John will actually go get Jeff and bring Jeff back, and then you say to Jeff, present, or whatever the command is, and Jeff will put his arm through the bar and let you take blood. In return for something that they like, right? It's positive reinforcement, but they won't do it if they don't want the treat. So that we deemed, if they're not running away screaming, which is what they do, if they don't want to do something, then they're acquiescing, okay? So they have to at least acquiesce. All right, so those were the principles, and as I told you, the three key features here that are kind of important from an ethics perspective is one, this presumption that you use humans first, second, that they're acquiescent, and third, that they have to live in ethologically appropriate environments, which I'll tell you more about in a second. So here's the conclusion of after looking at everything that had been funded, certainly in the last 10 years, from the whole range of the 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s, and looking back a little bit more at history. One that had been a valuable model, but it's sort of, just because they were valuable in the past doesn't mean they will be in the future. Second, there hadn't been any set of criteria to decide. So when the NIH got a proposal to use chimpanzees in research, they just treated it like using any other animal model. There wasn't any special set of rules, which seemed a little odd to us. Third, that the principles and the criteria, which I didn't show you, but are more or less the principles just for specific biomedical or behavioral research, they would provide a framework for everything that we looked at and everything that would come forward. The trajectory is heading to 0. So I told you about hepatitis C already. The other is that monoclonal antibodies have been created in the chimpanzee model, and so we argued that that should just be allowed to continue until it's done. But there are now replacement mouse, genetically modified mouse models that should be used instead, and so this is a 2-3 year problem for monoclonal antibodies. So the only case that would be left would be hepatitis C prophylactic vaccine development, and even that's heading towards a time when there will be a humanized mouse model, and the NIH should invest in developing non-chimpanzee models like the humanized mouse. So there's a group at Rockefeller University, and there's a group in Germany working with them to create effectively a mouse with a human liver. So you can expose that mouse to Hep C, and it will become infected, and while it doesn't have all of the symptomology of a human, neither do chimpanzees, it turns out, when they're infected with Hep C, because chimpanzees don't drink. That actually is the reason why you see such a different impact of Hep C infection in humans as opposed to chimpanzees. So humans are infected by Hep C, they don't know it for many, many years. They drink alcohol, which in combination with infection is really bad for your liver. Chimpanzees don't do the drinking part, and so it's not even a great model that way. You can only imagine if you gave chimpanzees beer and wine in captivity. It could be
Might
really
help
ugly.
with the ethics.
It could help with the ethics. Not so good with the control. So the one thing that really tied us in fits until we figured out we could sort of dodge it in a way was that the task, I didn't point this out, but maybe you noticed it, asked about future use. So it's this problem of being able or not being able to predict what will come, the crystal ball problem. And so it made it impossible for us to say there should be a prohibition, because you can never predict what the future might hold. And so we said, everybody we talked to, all the information that we were presented didn't articulate any likely use, but we said, well, it's possible there'd be a new re-emerging disease that could meet the criteria, the principles that we articulated, and so they should just be applied. Although we'll jump ahead to the implementation in a second. So you already heard me say what the recommendations were. What's interesting, in the all caps there, makes it obvious why I wanted to show you this. So the committee's report was issued in December of 2011. So our first meeting was in April, issued a finished report in December, which is actually very, very fast, part of why we couldn't do a kind of ethics tutorial. And the NIH gets a sneak peek a week ahead, so they knew what was coming. And the day that the report was issued, which was I think 15th of December of 11, there was a press conference at the IOM's headquarters, immediately followed by a press conference at the NIH by Francis Collins, the director, saying, I appreciate the work, I accept the report, and will implement all of its recommendations immediately, which is like unheard of. Which is unheard of, actually, not like unheard of, it is unheard of. To everybody's shock and surprise, but happily surprised, they adopted them immediately, which probably is an indication that they wanted us to say what we did anyway. We didn't know that because they were not supposed to meddle, and they didn't. But it made us think that they were just waiting for us to say the words, and then they could say go. What's interesting too, I told you 2/3, 1/3, the owned by the government or supported by the government. So the private sector owned chimpanzees, the places where they are held, have said we will also apply the same criteria to the privately owned chimpanzees as to the publicly owned chimpanzees. So it's effectively 100% coverage, which is also good. That's from Dr. Collins, no big deal there. So I don't know why this is part of the slides that I included. So there were well over 1,000 by the time it was all said and done. Partly because, so probably true here too, in the U.S. the news cycle is really quiet the last 2 weeks of the calendar year, as in the run up to the holidays. I don't think anybody thought this through, because they just wanted us to issue the report before the end of the year 2011, but because we issued the report in the middle of December, there was very little else going on, and so it got a lot of attention. That and the animal community wanted it to get a lot of attention, so they ginned it up as well. So anyway, lots of news covered lots of places. So I'm going to say something about implementation in a second here, so we're not quite done. So there's been some significant changes. One, the justification is much, much higher, right? And as I've told you, there's really only one existing case that meets that criteria, and in fact, that set of principles. And in fact, the committee was split 6-6 on whether even prophylactic vaccine research for Hep C would meet our principles and criteria, because half thought that you don't need to do challenge studies to do a prophylactic vaccine trial for an infectious disease. Think of the way we do HIV vaccine trials, right? We don't challenge individuals, but we let them be challenged through their normal unsafe behaviors. We tell them, don't do all these things that we know are risky, with full knowledge that, of course, some of them will. Don't inject drugs, don't have unprotected sex, blah, blah, blah. So Hep C is a very similar example. So you could do it, it just will take longer, right, and is a lot less controlled than if you inject them with hepatitis C virus. But that doesn't mean you can't do the research. So the question is it necessary to do a challenge study to do Hep C vaccine trials? I'm outing myself. I thought the answer was no. You don't need to. Does it make the science a little quicker? Yeah. Does it make the science cheaper? Yeah. Does it make the science better? Maybe. But that's not necessary. But half the committee, we went 6-6, so that we didn't have to say we split. We just couldn't decide. Okay? So, you probably asked me this, so I'll talk about it anyway. We spent a lot of time arguing with the folks at the IOM and then with the folks at NIH about whether we couldn't say something about all great apes. And they said, it's only chimpanzees. And we said, well, what about bonobos, which are, for most of human history, people thought those were chimpanzees, right? They're another pan species. Pan paniscus is bonobo, pan troglodytes is what we call a chimp. So they're really, I mean, they're incredibly close. And the answer was, we don't fund research in chimpanzees. We don't fund research in anything but chimpanzees. So don't worry about bonobos or orangutans or gorillas, the other great apes. Only chimpanzees. But there's no reason to take the argument and say it's only applicable to chimpanzees. That makes no sense. So then you sort of say, well, if it's good enough for other great apes, where do you stop? So where does the species distinction sort of stop? It's straightforward, right? What was really interesting, and I told you I was really reticent about how this was going to go, partly for my being co-opted. That was my one worry. And then the other was, well, if the information pulls us in one direction or the other, we're going to get lambasted by somebody, right? So either the research community hates you, which is probably less bad than the animal welfare, animal rights community hating you, because they hate in more violent ways, right? And I didn't, no one's, you can't hide anymore. You can't have an unlisted number or email. It doesn't really exist anymore in the world. So I was really worried. But it turned out that everybody loved us, which I don't have great insight about why, except to say, I think that the research community realized they're not that important as a species, they're expensive, it's bad PR, all of that. And the animal rights community says, aha, it's a first. We finally got one species off the table. It's the camel's nose under the tent, right? So you see whatever you want to see in the outcome, depending on which kind of stakeholder you are. And the NIH loved us because they could show to the animal welfare, animal rights community, look what we did. We took this species away. So the proof will be in the implementation, which of course is proof in the pudding. I told you, so I didn't tell you why. The process was, the NIH says, thank you very much, we will implement these immediately, but the director of the NIH can't just wave a magic wand. So he has to then, this current one's a he, it's been a she at some point in its history, says, I'm going to appoint a working group which will then give me implementation guidelines for how to take your recommendations and turn them into actual behavior. And so they took a whole year to do that. As you see, a little more than a year actually. So from December of 2011 to January 13, they did their work. And this is what they said. And there's a report online too, which you may have seen. If you want me to forward the link, I can do that. They said, given the future potential use, we don't really see any. The committee really didn't see any, but they said, they need to leave the door open. We say leave the door open, but reduce to 50 total numbers. So go from 950 to 50, which is huge. Keep only 50 for maybe some use in the future. Revisit that every 3 to 5 years because we can see this going to zero really quickly. So we can quickly go to none. No more breeding. So it turns out there's been a ban, a supposed ban on breeding NIH-owned animals, but the colonies, the places where these animals are kept, were actually breeding them illegally. They were breeding privately owned animals with NIH-owned animals, thinking that that was a loophole, so it wasn't two NIH-owned animals being bred. And it turns out that the methods that are used to keep them from having babies are not 100% effective, just like in humans. So they won't do spaying and neutering or the human equivalent because it alters the hormones and would affect the science. So they use Norplant. And Norplant's not 100% effective, and so some babies were born in spite of attempts to prevent that from happening. What's really interesting is of the 50, they said keep 50, but they should be split evenly between old and young, and more importantly between naive animals and exposed animals. So naive meaning never exposed to whatever infectious agent you're interested in studying, which is really hard to figure out how you do that over time if you don't breed. right, the proportions will get out of whack pretty quickly as they get used in research. So the view, I think, no one has said this to me, but I believe, is that we just won't have any need, and this 50 is a kind of temporary number, and we're going to zero rapidly. The most controversial things they said were, one, this committee said something about ethologically appropriate housing, and I and the IOM staff had numerous phone conversations that we met with the NIH working group leadership many, many times so they could better understand what we meant by ethologically appropriate, and we actually didn't know what we meant, very bluntly, because we didn't have a lot of time to figure that out, and we thought it sounded reasonable. So they worked through what it would take to provide truly ethologically appropriate housing, and they have come up with 1,000 square feet per animal, and that the animals should live in pods, groups, family groups of no fewer than 7, because that's how they live in the wild. So that means 7,000 minimum square feet enclosures. And I just saw yesterday, in fact, an article, news report from one of the primate centers saying most humans who work here don't have 1,000 square feet in their dwelling. It's probably more true here in Europe than it is in the States. True enough, but we don't forage for food, and we don't go forage to make our beds every night. I mean, there's lots of reasons why that's not, of course, a parallel example. But that would not only make it very hard, but it will make it very expensive to keep these animals in captivity, because none of the places that currently house these animals have that level of housing. They have these things called primadomes, but they're not 7,000 square feet for 7 animals. And then, to me, the most ethically, morally controversial part was that they said, in trying to turn our recommendation of acquiescent animals into real guidelines, said, this is a quote from their report, allow autonomous choice to participate, which is kind of shocking to me. So that's, remember we were having a little personhood conversation over coffee. So they are, I think, there was one bioethics-like person on the working group, Alta. Charles, do you know him? You know Alta, I'm sure. So Alta is a law professor at the University of Wisconsin, but does a lot of bioethics and policy. So she must have known what these words would mean. Good to meet you. So this is going to be really interesting to figure out, one, how do you measure that? So what would be evidence of autonomous choosing on the part of a chimpanzee to participate in research? And how do you give them enough information to make an autonomous choice? I mean, it's one thing to say, present knowing that means a needle's going to come into my arm in return for whatever treat I like. It's quite another to say you're going to put your arm out and it's going to be with a needle to inject you with hepatitis C. How does that work? So it'll be very interesting to see whether any of the proposed, so this is for proposed research going forward, whether anything is going to meet the criteria that we established at the IOM committee and that they then turn into these guidelines that will have to be approved by a yet-to-be-appointed new body that will review applying these guidelines and principles to proposed research going forward. So there'll be a third committee. There will be a standing committee for the review of proposed chimpanzee research. I think that must be it. So I've said more or less all this anyway. So this is what the folks in the animal research world are really interested in, the animal welfare folks. How do we take this approach and apply it to other species? Which is quite a challenge, actually. It's pretty easy to say, when you're thinking about the animal that's sort of the last resort species, only get to use it if you can't use humans and there's no other animal model. But that's not going to work when you start moving away from non-human primates. All right, I said I wasn't going to talk so much. So I'll stop.
Thank you very much.
Oh, sure.
Thank you. It's 10 to 3 now. We've got the room till, I think, past 3, but I know many of us can't stay that late, but we've got quite a bit of time for questions. So.
Please.
I've got to go soon. That was fascinating. Thank you, Jay. I think I maybe understood it better as it went on, but at first I thought the thing with hepatitis, that it was the necessary one, was because there was a significant risk of harm. But then I think you explained then that wasn't what it was. It's
To humans, you mean?
yes. So anyway, but put that to one side. It seems to me that most research like this has some kind of risk of harm to whoever does it.
Yeah.
And it seems like your second principle suggests that it's better to risk harm on humans than it is on chimps. Is that fair to draw that from what you said? And if so, do you agree with that?
So I would say with an additional caveat, which is when your goal is to study human health. And that is an easy one to add to the case of chimpanzees, because the only reason we use them is because we want to study human health but can't do it in humans. At least that's been the claim. Now it'd be much harder. So if you were to replace chimpanzees in your question with a rodent, pick your species. And the answer is we have more or less adopted as policy that it's more justifiable, better, to expose rodents to harm than humans to harm. Right?
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
and there's a implicit justification that humans are more important, and therefore that's why that's okay. That's why it's ethically acceptable to do it that way. So in a way, this example forces us to confront the question that you asked. The way out of it, and it's only because of the way the facts happened to shake out and in the policy question presented to this committee, was it is the case that we're only doing this research to better understand human health. We're not trying to do it to understand the pharmacology of a new chemical that may be a pharmaceutical in the future. Because that's not really, it's a human health question, but down the road, right? We just want to understand the toxicology, say. Then it gets, I think, to be we have to answer the question as you put it. And you know, there are people, I've gotten to know the animal welfare folks in the US very well, the Humane Society, right, which, depending who you ask, is either really militant or really kind of middle of the road. Their view is we should not use any animals in research, turns out. That's not very middle of the road. And it's an equivalent argument to say that you made, the IOM committee, around chimpanzees. It equally applies to whether it's a dog or a guinea pig or a mouse.
But you would agree that partly what you're putting the chimpanzee on, but at least an equivalent level of moral status as a human.
I wouldn't say that, no. But I think if you were to say, we have so here's where it gets harder.
Yeah.
I could do the same research on a chimpanzee or a human. Right? What's the morally more acceptable choice? I would actually say human. But that's because of the status of chimpanzees. I don't know that makes them morally equivalent. Now, if it's unethical to do it in humans, do I think it's acceptable to do it in chimps? Yes, because I just showed you that I endorsed that set of principles. So if it's acceptable to do it in humans, do it in humans. If it's not, then do it in chimps. So that tells you that I don't put them on equal moral footing. At least the committee doesn't, right?
Yeah.
And I was the chair of the committee, and I signed off on the report. So I have a sort of speciesist view of this at the end of the day.
I'm slightly worried about the rollout.
Yes.
Because, I mean, the question I insisted on asking in committees that I served on, two that were relevant to this one, use of primates in research and others, human-animal mixes, is why do we expect of science standards that we don't expect of farming, for example?
Yeah.
Or sports, or hunting, or just controlling vermin? I mean, why would one worry about experimenting on rats but not exterminating them? Why? So I'd just be interested in this sort of implies that that there is a friendly slope, if not a slippery one here, and that once you've sorted this, I think from what you said, a lot of animal welfare people think that too, once you've sorted this species, we just knock off all the other species endlessly. Is that where we should be going? And should we start with science in the way that you've done? Why don't we start with Sainsbury's and supermarkets? And,
So when I talk about animal research ethics with students, I start actually with food, because I think it's far more troubling from a moral perspective, the way we raise animals for food.
Because in no sense is it necessary.
Exactly, and we don't need that to survive. Yeah. So,
in fact, we may need it not to survive because of the global warming issues and the farting cows argument, which is a very powerful one.
Absolutely. So environmental, resource use, health, right? Human health. No, there's sort of no good argument at all, except that we like hamburgers. And so students follow it up to the point with what the implication is. That means I can't have a hamburger, and they don't want that, right? So they would much rather talk about using cute mice in laboratories and how problematic that is, which seems, as you just point out, totally inconsistent. So, no, I think you're totally right about where the ethical arguments take us, but it's much harder for us to, in the U.S. at least, to get a handle on food policy than it is to get a handle on biomedical research. There isn't the sort of IOM committee equivalent for how we raise and use food animals compared to how we use chimpanzees in research. That's not really an argument, but nice to meet you.
Unless there is a sensible way of distinguishing between types of animals, and saying that there isn't a slippery slope precisely because the great apes are qualitatively different in morally relevant ways than the Sunday roast.
Yes. Yes. Well, or mice and rats. Yeah. Right, and then you need to get into the game of, well, what features of these animals exist but in these but not in these. So and then we're back to all the animal.
And then we might be open season on fetuses, which are more like rats, but not on chimpanzees, which are less like rats.
Yes. Oh yes. And so it's interesting. So as I said, I've gotten to know some of the folks in the animal welfare world, and I was riding on a train from somewhere in Boston, I think, back to DC, and happened to be sitting next to somebody who was bending my ear about the food argument, and said, "Do you know how many chicken?" I said, "Yeah, it's a god awful number. I totally appreciate it." And she said, if it were up to me, we would eat none, but it's better to eat cows than chickens because at least you get more servings out of one cow than out of one chicken. I said, well, that's an interesting, articulation. Can I quote you saying that? She said, no, of course not. But for her, it was kind of an all lives are equal, right? All individual lives, and better to kill fewer than more.
But they're interesting argument. There were some studies. So this is last go at the question that. If you take the ecological arguments, the global warming arguments, then there are very interesting differences between animals. And in fact, battery chickens are much more ecologically friendly than cows free range in the fields. And probably only better than battery chickens are sheep on hillsides, because they don't use the land that's useful for other things. So actually, if you extend from the kitchen to the other effects on the environment, you get very interesting distinctions between animals, which have nothing to do with animal welfare.
Right.
But have something to do with...
I don't eat mammals, but it's because it's not so good for you, but it's also really hard on the environment, right? And the amount of, however you want to calculate it, pounds of other protein that it takes to produce a pound of meat, the amount of land that it takes, it's all bad. There's no question. But
except for sheep.
Except
for sheep.
Yeah.
Lamb
but I also have issues with
probably the best.
Just eating other sentient creatures is a little hard for me. And the chickens are sentient, I take it, but
only barely.
Yeah, barely, right, exactly. We're not
Yeah.
consistent. I think it's
Yeah.
probably not the defense, but the explanation. We're not consistent in that and 1,000 other examples. So what's interesting though is the view that the animal rights community has, that we finally have gotten to a place in policy where one species is not available, which had the NIH and the whole scientific research community had forever said science will drive us, not what you think is right, wrong, or indifferent. And so this is a big change. So the other thing I didn't say anything about is there's a pending legislation in Congress, because there's this view that we can't trust the NIH. They're doing the right thing today, but as soon as there's a new director and maybe a new president, which it will be, of course, after in 4 more years, then maybe we'll go back to the way it was before. And the only way to really make change is to make law. But the NIH, partly motivated by the worry of Congress making law, right? There's nothing worse to the people who work in the administration than having Congress tell them what to do. So again, one of the reasons that there was, I think, quick action was to put off, or maybe block altogether, what's called the Great Ape Protection and Cost Savings Act.
Which presumably would also force private use
Yes.
of chimpanzees to comply.
Which
We haven't said much about their response to the report.
Well, I think I did say that
did
the
you?
private, so the largest group is New Iberia, which is in Louisiana, which is actually the group that's just sent 120 into sanctuary. They own the largest privately held group, and they've said they would apply the same criteria to the privately owned animals as to the public, which is, I think, a really important point that people have not paid attention to. Because as you say, the public-private distinction is very important in the U.S. context, more than elsewhere. Another craziness of the civics of the United States. We don't have this sort of omnibus, law is law, policy is policy. We have this public-private distinction, which it holds in all sorts of other areas as well as in research policy.
And will there be ramifications beyond science, such as zoos, for example?
Such as?
Zoos who maintain chimpanzees and presumably study them for their own behavioural needs.
So the big worry from the perspective of the zoo community is the ecologically appropriate housing, right? So they're not bound by it, but I think that their view is, well, gosh, if it's good enough for the research animals, right, then we probably have to go that way as well. And one of the members of the NIH working group is a guy who's the head of whatever that area of the zoo is at the Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago. So they had a zoo person, know full well what the implications would be for his world.
So on the zoo front, I've spoken to Frans de Waal on a number of occasions about this, and in some ways, of course, he's doing a great deal for sympathetic responses to animals, particularly primates.
Yeah.
But on the other, it's almost certain that he's also not obeying your recommendations on, or the animals he uses in the zoos that he uses, for example, in Switzerland, where he studies elephants and so on, are not obeying your ecological environment rules. So there's a sort of tension between wanting to encourage his work because it makes people more sympathetic to animals, but wanting to discourage it because it doesn't abide by the recommendations that you make.
One of the sort of another aspect of the handwriting on the wall is that the focus of the NIH working group, and really the focus of the IOM committee, was these are the conditions that have to be met for biomedical research. Very few are left, right? That are very few examples are going to meet. And behavioral kind of gets a free pass because what they do is almost exclusively non-invasive research. So the NIH working group said we don't need more than 50, and then really 50 for biomedical research, potentially going forward. So what happens to Frans de Waal? There aren't going to be the large numbers of animals around for him, and I think nobody believes, NIH working group, IOM, that there needs to be large colonies of captive chimpanzees kept just for the purpose of behavioral research. You can do that in zoos, you can do that in sanctuary. You need to figure out how to do it in places that have been non-traditional to you, but you were using these captive animals because it was convenient, not because...
But he wouldn't be able to do it in zoos either, because the space requirement, for example, is not a reward for the animals undergoing risk.
Yeah.
In animal experimentation, it's a concern for how it's legitimate to keep animals in captivity.
In sanctuary. So it looks like, I mean, I would say, where do they need to focus? There's a guy at Duke named Brian Hare, who's kind of a champion of doing behavioral research in natural environments. So sanctuary in the U.S. means they live on an island in Louisiana. I mean, that's Chimp Haven is this place that's set aside, and that's called sanctuary. But what he means is, in Rwanda, there are big tracts of land set aside to protect chimpanzees, and he's doing research on animals there. So he gets them to trust him, and he goes out into their habitat and does work with them. And his view is that should be the
It
sum total
solves the
of what we
voluntary
do.
problem, because if they then pile
Right.
up the crates, there are volunteers.
Right. And there are exactly. There are really interesting. There are examples, I think, Franz, among the people doing it, where they don't offer treats. There's not even positive reinforcement. They offer them. They can go into the facility to do. They do spatial recognition studies, where they go in and they enjoy it. Apparently, they go in to do it because they think it's fun to do, and they don't get anything from it except the whatever positive feedback they get from getting it right. They don't give them food, they don't give them anything. There's no human interaction. So they just wander into the place with the screen, participate or not. And that would, for instance, meet the criterion for voluntary or autonomous decision making. Yeah.
It would be it would be very overstringent, though, wouldn't it? Because we don't think that people like me, who are induced to come to work because I'm paid, are not being volunteers
Right.
nonetheless.
Exactly.
So it's a far more stringent.
Exactly. But you're also not a captive in the in your office.
But in the example that you made, where they wander in, there would be no reason not to give them rewards if they wander.
Yeah. Well, I
Any
think
more
that-
than there's any
that's-
reason, I hope,
it's
not to
proof-
give me rewards when I
except
wander
that
in.
It's a little more Pavlovian, right? It's only proof that they do it in return for something that they like, rather than they do it because they are engaged by it. That's the argument. But as you say, look, they're living in a artificial, no matter how ethologically appropriate,
Yeah.
it's not the forest wherever they would otherwise be.
Yeah, I was wondering if this ethological housing does not imply a tension with the non-breeding part of the policy or these steps, because I suppose that the non-breeding is for all the other people not to be tempted to use these chimps on research, or why should they not let them breed?
So that there won't be more chimps in captivity. So they can have sex, they just can't have babies.
Okay.
So they're not kept apart.
Okay.
But that would be violating, as you say. But they're not kept apart now. It means they are if they're infectious or something. But they're not, males and females are not kept separately. So the problem is they're not supposed to be bred intentionally. And so that was being violated by actually the private groups. But also they have sex and the birth control doesn't work. So then babies were born.
Okay.
And so part of the problem was, I don't remember how many. I don't know that actually anybody knows exactly how many were born in violation of the breeding ban. But it's more than a handful. It's in the probably low hundreds. So the problem is, if you want to keep a cohort of 50 that are demographically diverse, and diverse in terms of naive versus exposed, where are they going to come from over time? Which they didn't answer, and I asked this of the chair of that group, and he said, off the record, we don't think that there will be a need in a few more years. It's not going to be relevant. I said, I agree with you, but it kind of dodges the question.
Yeah, because if there's need, they're going to go back and capture them or use them.
Yeah, they won't capture. So what they will do is allow them to breed.
Yeah.
There'll be no wild capture. So that would violate, from the U.S. perspective, the Endangered Species Act.
Okay.
So we have other unrelated, non-biomedical research policy that's about the forestry service. So you can't go and capture certain kinds of wild animals, and chimpanzees among them. Yeah, so they would have to allow them to breed. Hi.
Hi, it's very interesting. I have two questions. The first one, very interesting in the shift from the change of the presumption from like using animals first to using, because you talked about it's only we are using animals only when it's ethically unacceptable to use human beings. But I'm thinking, is that because the research are going to benefit the human beings? Because I'm thinking of some other diseases, it's only affected humans but also on animals. What about the problem of rabies?
Problem of
Rabies?
Yeah, rabies, because it's humans and dogs are both will be affected. So in this case, I'm going to use humans or dogs.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know of whether rabies research is done on humans. I think that the point of the way we thought about it and it came out of the principles was every argument we heard was this is to study human health, but we can't do it in humans. So we just said, well, let's make that a requirement. Do it in humans if that's what you're studying, unless it's unethical to do it. And so that took away a whole range of areas that had been formerly used in chimpanzees because it was convenient and easier. So I'm not sure how much traction that argument has outside of that one example. But maybe that's another. I don't know enough about the science of rabies and humans versus dogs. I mean, bats as well, right? Bats are also carriers of rabies, so maybe that would be and then people care much less about bats than they do about dogs.
Not in England. Protected species in England.
Is that right? Why? Because they eat mosquitoes or something?
No, just because they're rare now. And,
Interesting. I know they're like flying vermin in the U.S. So, I mean, part. I thought you were asking a different question. Maybe you were. So you've heard Tom say this, and he's right. So, if humans and if chimpanzees share many of the features of humans, that they deserve moral respect, let's just use that language, and it's unethical to do something in humans, why would it be ethically acceptable to do the same thing in a chimpanzee? That's a much harder question, and it goes a bit to the question that asked before he left, which I didn't answer in quite the way maybe he intended. Which is, can you defend using animals, or humans for that matter? I mean, when it's risk of harm, are you saying it's more acceptable to expose chimpanzees to harm than human, or the converse of that? And as I said, I think that it was pretty clear from the committee's work that we thought it's more acceptable to expose any animal, whether a chimpanzee or a dog or a bat. It's just going to be harder to justify as you get further away. And how you articulate further, of course, is where you get into more interesting discussions. We just didn't have to do that in a way that it was lucky. We wouldn't have been successful, I'm sure. But we were told, don't talk about anything but chimpanzees, so that was in a way fortunate. So that was one. You asked one, you said you had two questions.
Another one is because using humans first it sounds like quite a counterintuition to our past beliefs.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, what's the value like on the line? I think you have already answered it.
And I think it's an easier case in the example of chimpanzees because the uses have been so few, and the use of humans is ethically acceptable and probably will give you better science. Well, not even probably, will give you better science. So that, as long as those two things are true, ethically acceptable to do the research and you're going to get higher quality science, then you should use humans. I don't think anybody would argue with that. It just, as you get to things that you really can't ethically do to humans, then when is it acceptable to use other animals, non-human animals? That's the harder question. And so one interesting attempt, so there are a few groups. Tom is working on a project with a colleague at George Washington University.
Tom Beecham.
Sorry, Tom Beecham. A friend of both of ours, and we had dinner together, which is why I keep saying you heard him say, because we had this conversation in Washington. Trying to take some of the framework, a necessity framework, and apply it to other species. What would that do to the way we now currently carry out research on animals? Would it change anything, and if so, how? And he's working hard to figure out whether this sort of notion of acquiescence could be extended. Not should, but could. So would we be able to assess acquiescence in a species other than a non-human primate? Assuming even that would work. So great apes, I think, is pretty straightforward. But what about other non-human primates like rhesus? Okay, maybe. What about dogs? Yeah, probably. What about rodents? It gets harder and harder. Although there is, it turns out, work where people have tried to assess the pain, not response, like response to stimuli, but rather the way a rat looks when it feels pain, its face looks, as a way of assessing whether it's acquiescent or not. That wasn't the reason the research was done, but maybe trying to use something like that. So there are some attempts to move past what is an admittedly easy case to see what would happen when you try to ask similar questions of different species.
Sorry.
I was thinking of this in the complete opposite way, because I thought it would be very easy to demonstrate, unless I've misunderstood what I mean by acquiescence in a rodent, because you can control their environment, you can breed them in great numbers, and over time scientists have chosen strains which are docile, that's the term they use. But is there a difference between docile and acquiescence?
Yes, I would say yes, there's a difference in that acquiescence in the way that we thought about it in chimpanzees, and part of the problem is if there's a better word in English, then I would love to hear what you think. Because we worked hard to try to find something that seemed to meet the criteria of didn't run screaming, so that's docile, you're right. But also seemed to have some sense of knowing what it was getting into without sort of using voluntary, because that seems to imply a different level of comprehension. So it's not quite docility, where you can pick a mouse up by its tail and put a needle into, and take blood from it. That's not acquiescence, except to the extent that they're not trying to bite you.
I think interesting in English, and your English is as good as mine, obviously, but acquiescence has a different sort of feel to it. It's not, it seems to me not, it's about choice. There are things you would choose to do, and there are things you would acquiesce in having happen, which you wouldn't have chosen, but if they're happening,
you submit to.
You don't object.
Yes.
But it's not comprehension relative necessarily.
Yeah.
So that's complex how
Yes,
we use acquiescence.
exactly. Well, and part of it, and we didn't, as you probably, if you have read the report, you've seen it. If you haven't, you'll go, if you care, go look. We tried to articulate acquiescence more by example than by conceptual analysis. But it would be interesting to know whether you think there's a better term. Whatever I showed you before, autonomous choice seems wrong, I think. I just don't know how you, first of all, know that a chimpanzee's is exhibiting autonomous choice, whether or not they have it, but let's even say they do. Voluntariness seems quite wrong. So what is the proper way to articulate what's going on?
The acquiescence is quite good. I think an analogy would be, if the only food available is pretty obnoxious, but it's edible, as in concentration camps or whatever, you eat the food, but you're not exactly voluntarily choosing it, but you are acquiescing in it. Even though other things so.
Yeah.
It's not a bad word.
Well, there's a certain sense of choice in that, at least the way that the researchers claim it happens. If the animal doesn't participate, they aren't punished. So there's no negative reinforcement that, if you don't do this, we'll hit you or poke you with an electric prod or something. And so it's only, we're offering you this, and if you accept it, this is the exchange. That's a little different. So we haven't worked that out yet. It's partly why the working group got a little, I would say, confused by the notion of acquiescence and used quite different moral language.
There is something else I wanted to raise, which I'm
Yeah.
surprised that Yang Wei didn't raise, because she's from the People's Republic of China, and that there are huge cultural differences. I mean, China, I think it's fair to say, but not only China, in Italy, for example, there is complete uninterest in animal welfare.
Right.
Almost total. They don't have the same Anglo-Saxon attitudes. And there are interesting contrasts in Europe, namely, in England you can do almost anything you like to early embryos. But in Italy and France and Germany, absolutely not. Whereas they'll do almost anything you like to animals.
Right.
And
Right.
so there are substantial differences which I'm not sure how you can generalize from the American or even
Yeah.
the British experience about.
Well, I would even, to your embryo example, oddly, in the US you can do anything you want to an embryo as long as you're not using public money,
Yeah.
right? But if you use public money, you almost can't do anything,
Yeah.
right? Not whether you want to or not. So, yeah, there are quite different cultural differences, and I would say even sort of regulatory sort of commitments and civics that are different. It's like, clearly culturally we don't seem to think that an embryo is sacrosanct. We just think it somehow should be treated differently if the public is paying for its use. So, I totally take your point.
And the other one I wanted to press you just briefly is you left the door open, and that's the necessity. And who knows what new disease will arise. New diseases arising all the time,
Yes.
for which chimpanzees may be a very good model, maybe the only model. And you sort of seem to be assuming that won't happen. But
Well, so everybody we talk to, and we talk to people from every stripe, so infectious disease folks to biodefense to Department of sort of offensive uses. They won't call it that, but that's effectively what they do, the biowarfare people. None of whom could articulate a case. We say, give us your best argument for why it would ever be necessary. And most of them say, even if a newer emerging or re-emerging disease were to show up, it would take too long. So it would be too late by the time we could ramp up in an animal model. We need different techniques. So they just say we wouldn't even think about it, not because we don't want to use animals, but because we don't think it would be useful to use animals. So, but you're right, never say never, which is, I think, part of why the working group said, well, we need some. Why they chose 50, no one can say. I think it was because it was a nice round number, and they thought it would be revisited
And
by
not too
somebody
excessive.
else, not too excessive, and it will be someone else's problem in a few years. We need to get our work done. Kick the can down the road a little bit.
A question very, very far away from the last ones. Do you think that this would impact how, for example, whales or dolphins are housed or the ethological conditions where they are in, for example, for behavioral tests or something like that?
So
or
one of the interesting things, which I didn't know until I got involved with it, so I had very little knowledge of primatology. And part of why they invited me, frankly, because I was a bit of a blank slate. So how do you distinguish great apes from other non-human primates? One is they can recognize self in a mirror, right? Or they have a sense of self, and they test that in ways that are probably pretty obvious. But they put rub a piece of some lipstick on the forehead of a chimpanzee and show it a mirror, and then they rub it off. So right? If you do that to a dog, it just barks and barks and barks. Right? It always thinks it's another dog, no matter how many times you show a reflection. And it's interesting, in chimpanzees, this is from a very, very young age, they recognize self. So, turns out, I live in Baltimore, where there's the Smithsonian National Aquarium is in Baltimore, it's not in Washington. And they do research on porpoises there, dolphins, who they also believe can recognize self. It's harder to test that. So dolphins can't rub things off of their foreheads. But they actually put marks on their bodies in places that they only can see when they look in a mirror. And the animal figures out that it can see its own body and puts itself in a position to look at a portion of its body it otherwise can't see which they now believe indicates that it also has a sense of self. But after those animals, there's very few others that anybody so far knows has that ability to recognize self. So if that's a criterion for moral respect, I mean, among the things that need to be on the list, then why would we treat those animals differently than we do chimpanzees? I think it's a very fair question, if that's meaningful. But I mean, we don't use them, right? Cetaceans are not used in research, right? And we don't catch them. I mean, they're part of, again, they're covered by yet another federal policy in the US. There was a big issue in California of a sushi bar that was serving whale meat, which is against, can't collect marine mammals of any kind in the US unless you have a permit, like for SeaWorld or one of these things. So they have been off the table as a research animal for a very long time.
We have about 5 minutes left.
I was just wondering why you think the mirror test is such a good test, because we've seen that European magpies can pass the mirror test, and they don't even have a neocortex.
Yeah.
So
the question is, how do they pass the mirror test in terms of recognition of self?
Yeah.
Is that what people believe?
yeah, it was. I think it was in 2006.
Yeah.
Deval did a study on it as well.
And they believe that that's the equivalent kind of recognition as great apes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I don't know. So I'm saying my knowledge of animal behavior is very thin. So then maybe it's a bad example, or maybe it means we should extend our thinking, right, to other species.
A lot of birds are tool users as well. Deval also has some very nice film of, crows. Adding stones to get the water level up so that they can up.
And that's another one of the
glass,
chimp examples,
yeah.
right?
But crows can do it too.
Yeah,
so.
that's what I was saying. That's one of those examples of why we think chimpanzees are special. But then again, right, if crows can do it.
I just have one quick question going back to John's point about cultural context. Were the media reports all generally positive and supportive?
Were they all positive? Yeah, actually. So they're absolutely 100% positive, which is interesting, right? There was maybe the New York Times may have done sort of what do we lose, but because there didn't seem to be much to be lost, or at least unless you think about the sort of crystal ball problem, there wasn't a big negative. You know, there were a few groups like FASEB, which is the Federation of Societies of Experimental Biology, which is an umbrella professional organization for science in the US. They were opposed to the recommendations because their view is whatever science needs, science should have access to. But absent that kind of thinking, it really was quite universally praised. It's interesting, so I did, among the media, I did a live conversation with BBC, but it was overnight service, whatever that's called. So we think of your BBC as overnight because it comes on in the middle of the night for us, but I was doing overnight over here. And the interviewer said, do you think this will change policy in the UK? After explaining, we had a back and forth, and I said, no, we are behind you in this one. Policy changed in the UK a long time ago, which I felt bad about because it was live radio. I felt bad correcting. He was asking whether he thought, I thought this would change the way you all treat chimpanzees in research. So there's a cultural difference, I think, built in here, in that you have given this up, and the rest of Europe well before we did. One of the arguments about that was that we in the US need to keep a colony because everyone else in the world comes to use them. So if we forsake them, then there will be no place to do this research. But when you actually start digging in and looking at what research was done, it's not true. So.
Are there any more questions? That was absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much
Nice to
indeed.
meet you all.
Wonderful.
Thank you for having me. brought you a bound copy.
Oh, don't worry. I'd only